The heat in Harmony Gulch was a physical thing, a thick, suffocating blanket woven from dust and despair. It pressed down on the town square, silencing the birds and baking the very life from the cracked earth. Flies buzzed a lazy funeral dirge around my head, but I refused to flinch. I stood on the rickety wooden block, a piece of merchandise on display, and focused on the only thing I had left, the ramrod straight line of my spine. A good, strong girl, my father's voice slurred, thick with the whiskey that was his only loyal companion. Barely 18, healthy teeth, strong hands. A hard worker she is. He stood beside the block, his hand trembling as he gestured toward me. The reek of his sweat and cheaper regret was a familiar poison in the air. He couldn't meet my eyes. He hadn't been able to for a week, not since he'd told me this was the only way to settle his debts. The men gathered below looked me over, their gazes as coarse as burlap. They were ranchers, miners, and drifters, their faces weathered by the sun and their own bleak prospects. They assessed my arms for strength, my hips for childbearing, my face for any hint of a spirit they'd have to break. I was not a person to them. I was a solution to a problem, a pair of hands, a warm body, an investment. Even the town sheriff was there, leaning against a post with his arms crossed, his tin star glinting with indifference. He was a lawman, but there was no law against a father selling his own daughter. Not here. "You have a spine of steel, Elara," my mother's voice whispered in my memory, a ghost of a melody against the harsh reality. She'd said it while braiding my hair, her hands gentle and sure. "Don't you ever let a man bend it for you." I clung to her words like a prayer. I forced my face into a mask of placid dignity, letting their crude appraisals wash over me. I would not give them the satisfaction of my tears. "We'll start the bidding at $20, the auctioneer, a portly man named Jedediah, called out. "25, a grizzled prospector shouted, his grin revealing a landscape of missing teeth. "30, came another voice. Each number was another nail in my coffin. My father shifted his weight, the jingle of the few coins in his pocket a pathetic sound. He was selling my future for the price of a decent horse. I felt a cold, hard knot of fury form in my gut, a feeling so pure and sharp it almost eclipsed the fear. The bidding crawled upward, a miserable, humiliating affair. $40, $45. It stalled there, and a wave of panic washed over me. What fresh hell awaited me with the toothless prospector? Then a new voice cut through the stagnant air, as cold and final as a winter frost. $80. A hush fell over the small crowd. The men turned, their expressions shifting from lecherous interest to grudging respect and even fear. A path cleared, and I saw him. He stood apart from the others, a man carved from granite and shadow. He was tall and broad, dressed in stark, dark clothing that seemed to absorb the relentless sunlight. His face was a grim mask, framed by a thick, dark beard, and his eyes were chips of winter ice. I'd seen him in town before. Silas Blackwood. A widower whose wife had died a year prior, some said from sickness, others from a broken heart. He was known for his desolate ranch and an even more desolate demeanor. Jedediah, the auctioneer, looked stunned. $80 for Mr. Blackwood. Do I hear 85? Silence. No one would bid against Silas Blackwood. Sold! Jedediah's gavel cracked against the podium. To Mr. Silas Blackwood for $80! The finality of it stole my breath. My father shuffled forward, his hand outstretched, to collect his silver from Blackwood. The coins clinked. A life exchanged. My father took the money and, without a single glance in my direction, scurried away toward the saloon, a ghost haunted by his own choices. Blackwood mounted the 3 short steps to the block. He didn't speak. He simply took my arm in a grip that was not cruel, but as unyielding as iron. He led me down and through the parting crowd. As we reached the edge of the square, my gaze snagged on something out of place. Leaning against the shadowed colonnade of the general store, a man stood watching. He was just a silhouette against the dim interior, but he wasn't part of the spectacle. He hadn't bid, hadn't jeered. He was just a flicker of stillness in a world of grubby motion, his face unreadable from this distance. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second before Blackwood pulled me along toward a waiting wagon. The stranger's silent observation was a question mark at the end of a brutal sentence, a final, unsettling detail in the day my life ended and something else began. The journey from Harmony Gulch was a long descent into silence. Silas Blackwood hadn't spoken a single word since claiming me. He just clicked the reins, and the wagon wheels ground out a monotonous rhythm against the dusty, rutted track. The world bled of all color until it was just shades of brown and a vast, pale sky. We passed no one. There were no other homesteads, no signs of life, just the endless, whispering prairie grass and the oppressive weight of the sun. The silence was a different kind of cage than the auction block, but a cage nonetheless. I thought, fleetingly, of the man in the shadows of the general store. His stillness had been watchful, not empty like the landscape. It was a strange, sharp memory in the dull ache of my new reality. After what felt like an eternity, the wagon crested a low rise, and Blackwood's ranch came into view. The sight of it sank a cold stone in my stomach. It wasn't a ranch. It was a scar on the face of the earth, a leaning shack, its timber bleached to the color of bone, sagged against the wind. A dilapidated barn stood nearby, looking as if one strong gust might return it to the dust from which it was built. A rusted water pump and a half-collapsed corral completed the portrait of decay. This was not a home. This was my prison, a place as merciless and isolated as the man who now owned me. Blackwood pulled the wagon to a halt and dismounted. I stayed put, my hands clenched in my lap, waiting for an order. He moved with a grim economy, unhitching the horses and leading them toward the barn. He returned a moment later, his expression unchanged. He didn't look at me as a person he'd brought to a new place. He looked at me as he might a new shovel he'd just purchased. He walked to the side of the shack and picked up a shovel with a splintered handle. He strode over to me and held it out. It wasn't an offer. It was a command. I finally met his gaze, my chin held high, searching for any flicker of humanity in his icy blue eyes. There was none. I took the shovel. The rough wood bit into my palm. Without a word, he pointed toward a collapsed section of a nearby fence line. Then he turned and disappeared into the shack. The message was clear. My life as a human being was over. I was now a tool, an object meant for labor. A hot, bitter fury surged through me, but I shoved it down. He would not see me weep. He would not see me break. Straightening my shoulders, I walked to the fence and began to dig a post hole, the hard, unforgiving earth resisting every strike. The first days were a blur of sun and sweat and silence. My life was measured in chores. I mended the fence until my hands were raw and blistered. I hauled buckets of water from the squealing, reluctant pump until my back screamed in protest. Blackwood would emerge from the cabin or the barn, issue a command with a curt gesture or a single guttural word: water, mend, haul, and then retreat into his own world, leaving me under his cold, dispassionate gaze. He watched me work sometimes from the porch, his face a stone mask. I was his property, and he was inspecting his investment. On the third day, I found a sheepdog lying still near the barn, its body already stiff. There was no sentiment in Blackwood's eyes when he saw it. "Bury it," was all he said, before turning back to whatever grim task occupied him. I dug the grave behind the barn, the shovel feeling impossibly heavy. Tears I had refused to shed for myself now fell for this poor, forgotten creature, another soul swallowed by the desolation of this place. As I covered the dog with the final layer of earth, a stubborn pride burned hot in my chest, a fire against the cold. My mother's words echoed in my mind, a shield against the crushing emptiness, a spine of steel, Elara. I finished the task, wiped my face on my sleeve, and stood up, my back aching but my spine straight. Blackwood could work me until my muscles gave out. He could starve me of kindness and conversation. He had paid $80 for my labor, and he would get it. But as I stood there, dirt on my hands and grief in my heart, I made a silent vow. He may have bought my body, but he would never, ever own me. The heat of summer didn't fade gently on Silas Blackwood's ranch. It was violently ripped away, replaced by a biting autumn wind that promised a brutal winter. The air grew thin and sharp, scraping the lungs raw with every breath. Frost painted the windows of the shack in the mornings, delicate patterns of ice that belied the cold's cruelty. My thin cotton dress, a relic of my past life, was a pathetic defense against it. My hands, once merely blistered, were now chapped and cracked, the small cuts stinging with a pain that never seemed to fade. The work remained the same, a relentless cycle of chores designed to grind a person down to dust. But amidst the grueling routine and the encroaching freeze, things began to happen, small, inexplicable things. The first was the water trough. It was my most hated morning chore, wrestling with the rusted pump handle until my shoulders burned, then hauling bucket after sloshing bucket to the horses. One morning I stumbled out of the shack into the pre-dawn chill, bracing myself for the familiar agony, only to find the trough already full to the brim, a thin sheet of ice just beginning to form on its surface. I stood there, confused. My first thought was Blackwood, but I dismissed it instantly. He would never spare me a moment of labor. He would have waited for me to do it, just to watch me struggle. I scanned the property, but there was only silence and the vast, empty prairie. I wrote it off as a fluke, a mystery I was too tired to solve. A few days later, it was the latch on the cabin door. It was a finicky piece of metal that had to be jiggled just so, and it often came loose in the wind, letting drafts snake into the small room where I slept on a thin pallet by the cold hearth. I returned from mending a fence one afternoon to find it fixed, not with a nail or a clumsy piece of wire, but neatly mended, a small, dark piece of leather, expertly wrapped and tied to hold it fast. That night I watched Blackwood by the firelight. His hands were large and calloused, powerful tools for ranch work, but they did not look like the hands that could perform such a small, neat repair. He did nothing for my comfort. Ever. The certainty settled in my bones. It wasn't him. The cold deepened. The firewood I was allotted was never enough, and I spent my evenings shivering under a threadbare blanket, the memory of warmth a distant dream. One evening, after a particularly brutal day of hauling rocks to shore up the barn's foundation, I returned to the cabin, my body aching with exhaustion, dreading the chore of scavenging for more wood in the fading light. But there, beside the cabin door, was a neat, generous stack of dry kindling and split logs, far more than my daily portion. My heart gave a painful thud. This was no accident. This was a gift, a deliberate act of kindness in a world that had shown me none. I slowly reached out and touched the rough bark of a log. It was real. As I gathered a few pieces in my arms, a profound, instinctual urge made me lift my head and look toward the distant line of pine trees that bordered the western edge of the property. And there he was. He was just a silhouette against the bruised purple of the twilight, a ghost at the edge of the tree line, still, silent. The same shape I remembered from the auction in town, the watchful presence in the shadows. He wasn't a threat, he was a silent sentinel. As I stared, he seemed to give the faintest nod, a barely perceptible motion, before melting back into the deepening gloom of the woods. I scurried inside, my heart hammering against my ribs. It was him, the man from the town. He had followed me. He was watching over me. That night, for the first time in weeks, the fire burned bright and warm. Blackwood sat across the room, brooding in his chair, oblivious. He didn't know that I was no longer completely alone. The acts of kindness, the water, the latch, the firewood, they were not random miracles. They were messages. They were a fragile thread of hope spun in the darkness. I didn't know who the man was or why he was helping me, but it didn't matter. The knowledge of his existence planted a tiny, defiant seed in the frozen ground of my heart. It was a secret warmth, a flicker of light in the oppressive dark, and it gave me the strength not just to endure, but to wait. The first snow came not as a gentle blanket, but as a flurry of icy needles, driven by a wind that moaned like a dying animal around the corners of the shack. The hope kindled by my silent guardian was a small, precious fire I tended carefully in my heart. Each chore I completed was tinged with a secret knowledge. I was not entirely alone. It made the cold a little less sharp, the work a little less crushing. I was splitting wood near the barn, the axe a familiar weight in my hands, when the rhythm of my life was shattered. 3 riders appeared on the horizon, dark shapes against the stark white of the snow-dusted prairie. They were not lost travelers. They rode with a grim purpose, their horses moving at a steady, deliberate pace toward the ranch. As they drew closer, I could see they were rough men, with thick beards and heavier coats than Blackwood's, the kind of men who looked more at home in a back-alley brawl than on a homestead. Blackwood emerged from the shack, his face unreadable as ever, but I saw the subtle shift in his posture. He was expecting them. He glanced at me, his eyes cold and flat. "Get back to the barn. Stay there." It was not a request. I dropped the axe and retreated into the barn's musty gloom, the scent of hay and old leather filling my nostrils. But I didn't cower in a stall. A primal fear, sharp and cold, urged me upward. I scrambled up the rickety ladder to the hayloft, my heart hammering a frantic beat against my ribs. I settled into the shadows, peering through a crack in the floorboards as the 3 men dismounted and stomped the snow from their boots. "Took you long enough," Blackwood's voice rumbled from below. "The snow slowed us," one of the men replied, his voice a gravelly rasp. He was a mountain of a man with a wild, tangled beard. "So this is the place." "Bleaker than you said, Blackwood." "You're not here for the scenery, Johnson," Blackwood said. A second man, clearly the leader, stepped forward. He was leaner than the other 2, with a scarred face and eyes like chips of flint. "Let's cut the pleasantries. Let's see the merchandise. Heard you got a prime one, at a bargain price." The word hung in the frigid air. Merchandise. The same word the auctioneer had used. A cold dread, far more chilling than the winter air, began to seep into my bones. "She's strong," Blackwood said, his tone purely transactional. "Healthy, does the work without complaint." The third man laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "We ain't buying a farmhand, Blackwood. The boys up in the northern camps don't care if she can mend a fence." The leader, Johnson, stepped closer to Blackwood. "Paid 80 for her, I hear. A steal. We'll give you 200, a handsome profit for a few weeks of your time." $200. The numbers meant nothing. It was their next words that froze the very blood in my veins. "They pay top dollar for a fresh face up there," Johnson continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial grumble. "Especially an unbroken one. She'll be worth her weight in gold by the time the winter's through." The hay beneath me seemed to fall away. The world tilted, the casual horror of their words sucking the air from my lungs. The northern camps. I'd heard stories. Brutal, lawless mining settlements where women were worth less than the gold they dug from the ground, passed from man to man until they were used up and discarded. Blackwood hadn't bought a worker, he had bought an asset to be liquidated. I was a head of cattle. He was fattening for a more profitable slaughter. The auction in Harmony Gulch hadn't been the end of my degradation, it was just the beginning. I hadn't been sold, I had been traded, from one cruel hand to another, even more monstrous one. Below, the deal was struck. They would stay the night, wait for the snow to let up, and leave with me at dawn. The fragile seed of hope my silent guardian had planted was crushed under the heel of this new, monstrous truth. What could his small kindnesses, a trough of water, a stack of firewood, do against this? He couldn't save me from a fate like that. No one could. But as the terror threatened to swallow me whole, something else rose to meet it. Hard, sharp, unyielding, my mother's voice, a blade in the darkness, a spine of steel. They thought I was merchandise. They thought I was unbroken. They were wrong. I would not be sold again. I would not be shipped north like livestock. My time had run out, and my choice was clear. I had to escape. I had to run. Tonight, the night deepened, wrapping the shack in a suffocating embrace of cold and silence. From my hiding place in the hayloft, I had watched Blackwood and his 3 visitors drink whiskey, their laughter echoing like stones rattling in a tin can. But now, an hour past midnight, the only sounds were the mournful howl of the wind and the drunken snores rumbling up through the floorboards. It was time. Fear was a living thing inside me, a frantic bird beating its wings against my ribs, but desperation was a stronger master. I repeated my mother's words in my mind, not as a comfort, but as a whetstone sharpening my resolve. A spine of steel. I slipped down the ladder, my bare feet landing silently in the hay. The air in the barn was thick with the scent of horses and impending violence. I crept to the large barn door, easing it open just enough to slip through. The cold hit me like a physical blow. The world outside was bathed in the ethereal silver light of a full moon, the snow a pristine, treacherous blanket that would record my every step. My target was the dark tree line, the same woods where my silent guardian had watched. It was my only hope of sanctuary. I moved from shadow to shadow, a ghost in my own escape, my breath pluming in the frigid air. The shack remained dark and silent. I was halfway to the trees, my lungs burning, hope a fragile spark in my chest. Then, a twig, hidden beneath the snow, snapped under my foot. The sound was as loud as a gunshot in the profound stillness. Going somewhere? The voice was a low growl right behind me. I spun around, my heart seizing. Silas Blackwood stood there, a hulking shadow detached from the deeper shadow of the shack. His face, illuminated by the moon, was a mask of cold fury. Before I could scream or run, his hand shot out and clamped around my arm like a manacle. "Did you think I was a fool?" he hissed, his grip tightening until I felt the bones grind. He began to drag me back toward the shack. "Did you think you could steal from me?" Just then, the door to the barn creaked open. Johnson and his 2 cronies emerged, drawn by the sound. Johnson grinned, a cruel slash in his scarred face. "Looks like your merchandise is trying to run out on the deal, Blackwood." Blackwood's rage boiled over. He shoved me hard, sending me sprawling into the snow. "Ungrateful little," he raised his hand, the moonlight glinting on the thick calluses, ready to strike me down. Crack! The sound ripped through the night, sharp and final. Blackwood grunted, a look of pure, stupid surprise on his face. A dark stain blossomed on the front of his shirt. He staggered, his eyes wide and unseeing, before collapsing face first into the snow he'd so fiercely claimed. Chaos erupted. Johnson and his men fumbled for their own pistols, their drunken sluggishness turning deadly. Another shot cracked the air, and the mountain of a man, the one who'd laughed about the northern camps, crumpled to the ground without a sound. Johnson got his gun free, firing a wild shot that whizzed past my head, but a third shot answered him, precise and deliberate. He clutched his chest and fell backward. The last man, eyes wide with terror, turned to run, but a final shot dropped him beside his friends. The silence that followed was heavier and more absolute than before, broken only by the whisper of the wind over the fresh corpses. From the edge of the tree line, a figure emerged, stepping from the shadows into the moonlight. It was him, my silent guardian. He held a pistol in his hand, smoke still curling from the barrel. He was taller than I'd realized, lean but solid, his face stark and serious in the cold light. He walked past the bodies as if they were nothing more than stones, his eyes fixed on me. He stopped a few feet away, the gun held loosely at his side. The air tasted of iron and ozone. He looked at me, huddled in the snow, and then at the dead men littering the ground. His voice was low and calm, with no hint of the violence he had just unleashed. "The law won't see this as justice," he said. "They'll see it as murder." He gestured, with his head back toward the wilderness from which he'd come. My name is Caleb Thorne. You can stay here and try to explain this to the sheriff, or you can come with me now." It wasn't a promise of safety. It was a simple choice, the first real choice I'd had since my father sold me. Stay here with the dead and face a law that had already failed me, or step into the unknown with the man who had just saved my life. I looked at Caleb Thorne's outstretched hand, then back at the body of Silas Blackwood. There was nothing for me here. I took his hand. His grip was firm and warm. Without looking back, I let him pull me to my feet, and together we left the dead behind us and stepped into the frozen, unknown night. Leaving the ranch behind was like walking out of one nightmare and into another. The moment we were swallowed by the tree line, the world transformed. The wind, which had been a mournful whisper on the prairie, became a ferocious, shrieking entity. It tore through the pines, ripping at my thin dress and biting at my exposed skin with thousands of icy teeth. A blizzard, which had been gathering its strength on the horizon, descended upon us with the fury of a vengeful god. Snow began to fall in a thick, blinding curtain, erasing the world, erasing the moonlight, erasing the path we had just taken. There was no past, only the frantic, desperate present. Caleb Thorne, the name felt strange and new on my thoughts, gripped my hand, his presence a solid anchor in the swirling chaos. He didn't speak. There was no breath to spare for words. Every ounce of energy was focused on the simple, brutal act of putting one foot in front of the other. The wilderness was alive and hostile. The snow piled up, turning the ground into a treacherous trap that hid roots and rocks. We stumbled and fell, pulling each other back to our feet. My legs were numb, my face a frozen mask. The cold was a living predator, seeping into my bones, stealing my strength, whispering promises of a final, peaceful sleep. More than once I felt my resolve beginning to fray, the temptation to simply lie down in the snow and let it all end becoming a siren song. But each time, Caleb's grip would tighten, a silent command to keep moving. Through the howl of the wind, another sound emerged, a low, hungry cry that sent a fresh spike of terror through me. Wolves. Drawn by the scent of the blood we'd left behind, or perhaps just by the scent of two struggling creatures weakened by the storm, Caleb pulled his pistol, firing a single shot into the air. The sound was swallowed almost instantly by the blizzard, but the answering howls receded, at least for now. We were being hunted. Just as I thought my body would give out completely, Caleb stopped. He pointed through the swirling snow at a dark, sagging shape ahead. A ruined cabin. It was little more than a pile of rotting logs with a partially collapsed roof, but it was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. He practically carried me the last few yards, kicking open a door that hung from a single leather hinge. We collapsed inside, out of the wind's direct assault. The relative stillness was a mercy. It was dark and smelled of damp earth and decay, but it was shelter. Caleb wasted no time. He rummaged through the pack on his back, producing a flint and steel. With trembling, half-frozen fingers, he managed to coax a tiny spark to life in a pile of dry tinder he'd found in a sheltered corner. The fire caught, a small, defiant flame that pushed back against the immense, crushing dark. It was the most elemental kind of magic. As the flames grew, casting flickering shadows on the ruined walls, the cold began to recede from a life-threatening enemy to a merely painful one. Caleb disappeared back into the storm for a few moments and returned with 2 rabbits which he quickly and efficiently prepared. As they cooked over the fire, a fragile peace settled between us. We were no longer rescuer and rescued, but 2 souls huddled together against a world that wanted us dead. He saw me shivering, my body racked by tremors I couldn't control. Without a word, he took off his own heavy wool coat, his only protection against the storm, and draped it over my shoulders. The garment was heavy and smelled of pine, leather, and him. The warmth that seeped into me was more than just physical. It was a profound and unexpected kindness. I looked at him then, really looked at him. His face was lean and weathered, etched with lines that spoke of hardship. but his eyes, in the firelight, were clear and steady. They held no judgment, no expectation. They simply saw me. "Thank you," I whispered, my voice hoarse. It felt like the first word I'd spoken in a lifetime. He just nodded, his gaze returning to the fire. We ate the rabbit in silence, the shared act of survival a conversation in itself. In the heart of that blizzard, surrounded by the ruins of a forgotten life and hounded by wolves, a fragile trust began to grow. It wasn't built on words or promises, but on a shared fire, a shared meal, and the simple, profound warmth of his coat. We were two strangers, bound by violence, fighting for a tomorrow we weren't sure we would see. The blizzard broke at dawn, leaving behind a world remade in crystalline white. It was beautiful and deadly. The silence was absolute, the air so cold it felt brittle enough to shatter. We left the ruined cabin, stepping into a landscape that offered no cover, our tracks a clear betrayal of our path. Caleb's pace was relentless. He knew, and I knew, that the brief reprieve the storm had given us was over. Someone would come looking for Blackwood and his cronies, and when they found them, the hunt would begin in earnest. We traveled for 2 days, speaking little, conserving our energy. Caleb taught me how to read the signs of the wilderness, how to walk on the snow without sinking, how to find the game trails. He moved with a quiet confidence that was both reassuring and intimidating. I was no longer the helpless girl from the auction block, but I was still a student in this harsh, new school of survival. We reached the river on the 3rd day. It was a wide, churning ribbon of black water, choked with great sheets of ice that ground against each other with a low, groaning sound. It wasn't completely frozen, but it wasn't clear either. A treacherous, moving puzzle. "Bounty hunters," Caleb said, his voice a low rumble. He didn't need to point. I saw them too. 2 men on the far side, dismounted, their rifles ready. A third was downstream, positioned to cut off any escape along the bank. They had outpaced us. They had anticipated our route. There was no way around. The only way was across. "Stay behind me," Caleb ordered, his hand already on the pistol at his hip. He started forward, moving from the cover of one boulder to another, his eyes scanning the shifting ice for a path. The first shot cracked the silence, kicking up a spray of snow and ice shards just feet from Caleb's position. He returned fire, a quick, deliberate shot that sent one of the men on the far bank scrambling for better cover. We were pinned down. We made a desperate dash for the riverbank, the air alive with the whistle of bullets. We scrambled onto the ice, a slick, unstable platform that shifted and moaned under our weight. Another shot rang out, and this time Caleb cried out, stumbling. He caught himself, but I saw the dark stains spreading on his left shoulder. He gritted his teeth, pushing me forward. "Go, keep moving." We were halfway across, leaping from one solid-looking ice floe to the next, when the bounty hunter downstream took aim. He was steady, confident. He had a clear shot. Caleb was trying to reload, his wounded arm making his movements clumsy. We were going to die here, on this river of ice. In that moment, something inside me broke. It was the last vestige of the victim, the final thread of the girl who stood silently on the auction block. I would not die like this. I would not watch this man who had saved me die for me. My eyes fell on the pistol tucked into Caleb's belt on his uninjured side. Without thinking, I lunged, pulling it free. The metal was shockingly cold and heavy in my hand. I had never fired a gun in my life, but a primal instinct took over. I raised the pistol with both hands, just as I'd seen Caleb do, aimed at the dark shape of the man on the bank, and pulled the trigger. The recoil slammed my arms back, the sound deafening, but across the river the man jerked and fell, his rifle clattering onto the ice. The shock of my own action was a lightning strike. I had taken a life to save ours. "Elara, now!" Caleb yelled, pulling me from my daze. We scrambled for the far bank, the remaining hunters' shots going wild in their surprise. We hauled ourselves onto the snowy embankment, just as a tremendous cracking sound echoed behind us. The ice floe we had just abandoned gave way, plunging into the churning, black water. We didn't stop. We plunged into the dense woods, putting as much distance as we could between us and the river. Only when the sounds of pursuit had completely faded did Caleb finally slump against a tree, his face pale, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The roles were now reversed. He was wounded, and I was the one who had to be strong. I gently helped him out of his coat and tore a strip from my dress to create a makeshift bandage for his shoulder. The wound was a clean shot, straight through the muscle, but it was bleeding badly. I pressed the cloth against it, my hands steady. "Found a shallow cave just up this ridge," he managed to say through clenched teeth. I nodded, my fear replaced by a cold, clear purpose. I put my arm around him, taking on his weight. "We'll get there," I said, my voice firm. As I helped him stumble through the snow, our dynamic had irrevocably shifted. I was no longer just the person he was protecting. We were equals, partners in this brutal fight for survival. I had saved him, just as he had saved me. And as I tended to his wound later in the quiet dark of the cave, I knew I was no longer running from a past I hadn't chosen. I was running toward a future I would fight to make for myself. The wound on Caleb's shoulder was a grim anchor, slowing our pace and tethering us to a vulnerability we couldn't afford. But it was also a forge. In the days that followed our escape from the frozen river, the last of the barriers between us crumbled away. I was no longer the frightened girl he'd pulled from the snow. I was his partner. I learned to hunt with the pistol, my hands growing steady, my eyes sharp. I learned which plants were safe to eat, how to build a smokeless fire, how to clean his wound and change the dressing with a tenderness that surprised us both. We moved deeper into the untamed wilderness, leaving the world of men, of bounty hunters and auctions and cruel bargains, far behind us. We traveled not with the frantic desperation of escape, but with the quiet purpose of pilgrims searching for a sanctuary. The land began to change. The stark, snow-choked pine forests gave way to rolling hills thick with aspens, their white bark like silent sentinels guarding a secret. One afternoon, after cresting a high, rocky ridge, we saw it. Spread out below us was a valley, a perfect emerald bowl cupped in the hands of the mountains. A creek, clear and bright, snaked through its center, and the grass was so green it hurt the eyes after weeks of snow and shadow. It was untouched, untamed, and utterly peaceful. It felt like the world's first morning. We stood there for a long time, the wind gently rustling the trees around us, the silence filled not with menace but with promise. Caleb looked at me, a question in his steady gaze. I didn't need to speak. He saw the answer on my face. This was it. This was the place where we could finally stop running. The work that followed was the hardest I had ever known, but it was a different kind of labor. It was not the soul-crushing toil of Blackwood's ranch. It was the work of creation. We were not just surviving anymore, we were building. Together we felled trees, our movements falling into a natural, unspoken rhythm. The sharp bite of the axe, the groan of falling timber, the scent of fresh-cut pine, these were the sounds and smells of our new life. Caleb, his shoulder slowly healing, showed me how to notch the logs, how to fit them together with a precision that was both an art and a science. We laid a foundation of stone hauled from the creek bed, our hands raw but our spirits buoyed by the sight of the walls rising around us. We were building more than just a cabin. We were building a home. In the evenings, we would sit by the fire, the frame of our future silhouetted against the star-dusted sky. We began to share our stories. He told me of a life before he was Caleb Thorne, of a family wronged by a powerful man, a story that had set him on a lonely path of justice and retribution that led him eventually to the shadows of Harmony Gulch. I, in turn, told him about my mother, about her belief in my spine of steel and the crushing weight of my father's betrayal. Speaking the words aloud didn't erase the pain, but it robbed it of its power. In sharing our pasts, we were laying them to rest, clearing the ground for something new to grow. We planted the small pouch of seeds Caleb had carried in his pack, corn, beans, and squash. I pressed them into the dark, rich earth with my own hands, a profound sense of hope welling in my chest. This was not a grave I was digging, but a garden. Weeks later, we stood on the small porch of our finished cabin. It was small and rugged, but it was ours. The roof didn't leak, the door was solid, and from the window we could see the first green shoots pushing up from the soil. Caleb's arm rested lightly on my shoulder, his touch no longer that of a rescuer or a guardian, but of a partner. Looking out at the valley, a vast expanse of green and promise, I knew my story was not over. The auction block, the desolate ranch, the frozen river, they were all just chapters in a book I was only now beginning to write for myself. My past had been a story of survival, written in blood and fear. But here, standing on the edge of a land we could finally call home, side by side with Caleb, I knew this new chapter would be different. It would be a story of life, of hope, and of a future we would build together. This was not an ending, it was a beginning.